Great. So when we get started, it's my great pleasure to introduce Milind from Harvard, the Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science there. He's also Director of the Center for Research for Computation and Society at Harvard. And in addition to that, he's Director of the AI for Social Good at Google Research India. Long list of awards. I'll leave him some time to speak, so I won't give them all. But certainly the Hitchcock McCarthy Award, chief amongst them, and local to Informs. He actually, quite a number of years ago, 2012, I think it is, won the Wagner Prize for work that he did with the Coast Guard. So really looking forward to this talk, and virtual welcome to Milind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this welcome. Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate the opportunity to be able to present virtually. I'm supposed to be traveling to India soon after, and I just didn't want to take a chance traveling and then maybe carry something with me to my family in India. I don't know how their vaccines work, all that kind of stuff. So thank you. I'm going to, as the title suggests, I will emphasize our results from deployment a little bit more in this presentation. So let's get going. For the past 15 years, my team and I have focused on advancing AI and multi-agent systems research for social impact, focusing on topics of public health, conservation, and public safety and security, with the key challenge of how to optimize our limited intervention resources. So I'll just jump right into some of the lessons we have learned. First, achieving social impact and AI innovation go hand in hand. With respect to public health, we have large populations to serve, limited number of social workers or public health resources. Concrete example is work we've done with youth experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles, where harnessing the social networks of these youth, we're able to show that our influence maximization algorithms are far more effective in reducing HIV risk behaviors compared to traditional approaches. But this required then advances in influence maximization algorithms and bandit algorithms. With respect to conservation, we have large conservation areas to protect limited number of ranger resources. Concrete example is work we have done in Uganda and Cambodia, where harnessing past poaching data, we are able to predict where poachers set traps or snares, and for the past several years have been able to remove thousands of these snares. But this required us to make innovations in what we've been calling green security games, which combines machine learning and game theory. In the past, in the context of public safety and security, we've contributed a new model called Stackelberg security games and contributed new algorithms that have been used by the Coast Guard, the US Federal Air Marshal Service, the LA Airport, and others. Although these are diverse set of applications, underlying it are common set of multi-agent systems models. Today's talk, I'll focus on public health and conservation. The second lesson is all of the work I'll discuss is in partnership with communities and nonprofits. This is very crucial. Ultimately, our goal is to empower these nonprofits to use AI tools and avoid being gatekeepers to AI technology for social impact. Third, it's important in this area of AI for social impact to look at the entire pipeline from data to deployment beyond focusing purely on the algorithms. We'll start by immersing ourselves in the domain, trying to understand the kind of data that are available, the kind of problems that are faced by a nonprofit. Following that, a predictive model makes predictions on which of the cases faced by a nonprofit may be high risk versus low risk. However, since we cannot intervene on all of the high risk cases, this is where our multi-agent reasoning comes in for intervention to recommend which high risk cases to actually intervene on. And following that, of course, is field testing and deployment, not only because we want to improve our models and algorithms, because social impact itself is a key objective. So with this introduction, let me jump into the topics I'll cover today. The first is social networks and HIV prevention. Some of you might have seen this before, and if so, please feel free to read your emails for the next 10 minutes, and I'll come back to the next topic, which is on restless bandits for maternal and child care. I'll cover papers from 2017 to now that have appeared in AMAS, AAAI, HCA, etc. I'll highlight the role of the key PhD students and postdocs by putting up their pictures in the top right-hand corner of the slide on which their work is shown. So let's start with HIV prevention. This work was done while I was at USC in Los Angeles. Here, preventing HIV among youth experiencing homelessness is a major challenge. There's 6,000 youth who sleep on the streets of Los Angeles every night. The rates of HIV in this population is 10 times the rates of a normal housed population. So homeless drop-in centers and so forth will try to educate a limited number of peer leaders to spread HIV information. The key idea is to recruit peer leaders, educate them about HIV prevention, and expect them to talk to their friends and their friends to talk to their friends, information to spread in the social network. So this is real face-to-face interaction. This is not happening over Facebook, etc. So concretely, we are given some kind of a social network here. Each number is a youth experiencing homelessness. A red edge depicts a friendship between two youth. And now we have to select some number of youth as peer leaders to maximize expected number of influence nodes for reducing HIV risk behaviors. And we have our colleagues in social work who will educate the youth who are selected as peer leaders. So the idea is that if we select a youth C and educate them, C will talk to their friend D with a probability of 0.4, and then D will talk to E with a probability of 0.4. And in this way, this particular independent cascade model will lead to information being propagated in this network. So this brings up the fourth lesson that we've learned in this AI for social impact. That lack of data and uncertainty is a key feature of AI for social impact work. So in this case, of course, there's uncertainty in propagation probability over edges. We have multi-step dynamic policies in the sense that youth, we recruit them, but they fail to show up for information sessions. And then we have to recruit the next set of youth to compensate for youth who didn't show up. And finally, the social network itself is not known. All we have is a limited budget to query a few of these youth in order to cover a small fraction of the network. I'm going to, in the limited time available, sketch some ways we solve these problems and then focus more on the actual deployments and use. So first, with respect to uncertainty in these networks, normally we would assume that we know the exact propagation probability, that if a youth C is informed about HIV prevention, there's a specific probability 0.4. We know that youth D will be informed about HIV prevention. However, in this domain, these probabilities are not known exactly. So we can model this as sampling from some distribution, but even that may not capture all the uncertainty we want to capture. So we may say the mean of this distribution itself may lie within some interval. And now we are faced with the problem of robust influence maximization, where our algorithm is trying to choose peer leaders, whereas we cast this as a game, a zero-sum game against nature, and nature is trying to choose parameter settings to cause our algorithm to perform as worse as possible. So we are trying to maximize from the influencer side, the total influence, and nature is trying to minimize, where the payoff is given as a ratio of the outcome of our particular policy choice to the optimal possible had we known the parameter settings ahead of time. So this is kind of some measure of regret. Now, there's in the paper, we highlight how we generate a mixed strategy and sample a pure strategy and so forth. In the interest of time, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how this game actually gets solved. So if we imagine a network of 400 youth, and we are trying to choose 40 peer leaders, 10%, that's 400 choose 40. So that's a large number of policies for the influencer. Nature is trying to choose parameter settings from a continuous interval. So there's a large number of strategies for nature as well. So this is a massive scale game. We cannot represent it in memory, let alone trying to solve it. So the way we go after it is initialize the game with a small number of strategies on both sides. And then, having solved the game, the influencer's oracle provides its best response, nature's oracle provides its best response. The game grows, and we iterate in this fashion until convergence, and we can show that we can converge with some approximation guarantees. So that's robust influence maximization. The second is sampling of networks, this idea of exploratory influence maximization. So you can imagine, and in fact, this is how the work was done initially, that our social work colleagues would sit in the drop-in center and survey each youth and do field observations to uncover the entire social network. But this is clearly not going to work if we want to have this work deployed across different cities and so forth. So we want something simpler, less costly. So the idea then is, can we query a small number of these youth, say 15% of the youth, and then just based on what we learn from them, we ask them, okay, who are your top 5 friends or something like that? Just what sample we get from them, can we then solve our problem of choosing k-peer leader nodes such that the performance is similar to optimal possible had we known the full network ahead of time? So the key here is to figure out the right sampling strategy. And there's a sampling algorithm that samples nodes randomly and estimates the sizes of its communities that the node belongs to, and then chooses seeds from the largest K communities. In the AAAI paper, there are some performance guarantees of this algorithm. But having solved these challenges, the system we built is called Change. It combines network sampling, as I mentioned, robust policy generation, and then it offers recommendations on which peer leaders to select in order to spread influence. And so we conducted a study with 750 youth experiencing homelessness. This is joint work with Professor Eric Rice of social work. And then in the 3 arms to the study, Change had 250 youth, degree centrality, 250 youth. This is the more traditional approach of bringing in the most popular youth, and control where there is no youth being selected at all. And then in each case, peer leaders were selected based on the particular algorithm. In Change, it was, of course, our algorithm, degree centrality, nodes with the highest degree, and control group, none. And then at the end of 1 month and at the end of 3 months, we looked at whether there was actual reduction in HIV risk behaviors. And so as far as we know, first large-scale application of influence maximization for public health, hopefully Eva and other co-authors are happy about it. And this work was jointly done with our colleagues in My Friend's Place, Los Angeles LGBT Center and Safe Place for Youth, 3 drop-in centers in LA. And so we want to look at the end of 1 month, what has happened with respect to HIV risk behaviors. So we chose peer leaders, and at the end of 1 month, looked at the 250 youth in each case, in each of the 3 arms. What we find is that in terms of reduction in condomless anal sex, which is one of the HIV risk behaviors, we can see that there is a significant reduction in this particular HIV risk behavior because of Change, but not as much with the degree centrality and control. In fact, there was no reduction in this risk behavior. At the end of 3 months, clearly degree centrality began to catch up, but still not as good as Change. And the fact that Change was able to cause this reduction in HIV risk behaviors faster is important, because this is a risk behavior. And secondly, this is a community where youth come and go, and therefore having this message spread faster and behavior change occur faster is important. We also looked at other HIV risk behaviors, such as reduction in condomless vaginal sex. At the end of 3 months, again, you can see that Change outperforms degree centrality or the control group. In the AAAI paper and in the JADES paper, you can see more statistical significance results and so forth. Here's what Alison Hurst.
A way to kind of like marry this tech world with this social service world, like, and how we can kind of go deeper and impact young people and elevate them.
So I wanted to also highlight some next steps. There's clearly a lot more to do. One of those areas is fairness in influence maximization. In some networks, you can see that there can be disparity of how influence is spread across different racial groups, for example. And to remedy that, we've presented in our NIRPS paper a max-min approach to maximize minimum utility for any community, a diversity constraints approach, which is motivated from cooperative game theory. But each of these offers point solutions. It says this is how much trade-off there will be exactly between fairness and performance. And so in the AAAI 21 paper, we presented an approach to control this trade-off so that a policymaker has control over a parameter to choose the particular trade-off they want in terms of fairness versus performance. More recently, there's work trying to look at reinforcement learning at pieces of these problems. So for example, for network sampling, could we take that piece away and use a RL approach compared to the earlier algorithm I mentioned from AAA I-18? We can show that we can do better than that. Similarly, for speeding up influence maximization. So the idea is that if we can just give a policy to a homeless shelter, they can just run the policy rather than running the whole change algorithm. And it turns out that essentially we can achieve similar performance to change by training our model on some other graph and then actually testing them at runtime on a different graph. So these are all promising. Combining all of these together and testing them in the field remains some very interesting challenges for future work. So at this point, I'm going to switch and talk about a second topic, which is the use of restless bandits for maternal and child care. This is work that is going on at Google Research India. Please go on.
One question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you want to take questions as we go or at the end.
If it's a clarification question, I can take it now. If it's a longer question, I can, if you can wait till the end, that would be better just so that I can get a better management of time.
I'll wait. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I was saying, basically the situation in India with respect to maternal and child care is difficult. The woman dies in childbirth every 15 minutes. 4 out of 10 children are too thin or short. And we are very fortunate to be working with a nonprofit called Arman, which has 25 million women that they serve. One of their signature programs is called M-Mitra. It's a weekly 3-minute automated voice message to mothers and new or expecting mothers. It's something like this. It's, the message may say, you are 6 weeks into pregnancy, you should use this health supplement, or your baby is 3 months old, enroll them in this government program. It's a message delivered in the local language, in the voice of the local health worker. And they've shown in randomized control trials that women who listen, there's 140 messages that get delivered on a weekly basis, listen to these messages week after week, benefit significantly in terms of their health, their baby's health. And 2.2 million women have enrolled in this program. So where do we come in? Unfortunately, a significant fraction of women enroll, but then become low listeners over time, 30 to 40%. Arman has a limited budget to service these health to these mothers. So basically, you can do a service call to a small number of beneficiaries to try to retain them in the healthcare program in M-Mitra. So you can think of it like this. We have a large number of beneficiaries, 200,000. We have to choose, say, 2,000 or 4,000 of these per week where we can have a service call such that we maximize the total number of health messages that the mothers listen to. So I'm going to use an example of just 5 mothers. There's one health worker who's trying to offer service to 5 of these mothers. 4 of them have not listened to a Mitra message last week. 1 has, which is shown in green. Now the mother may can only select 2 in this case. So she may say, I'm going to call the first 2 mothers. However, now she has to, based on these calls, figure out what will happen next week. And what she sees is 2 of these mothers have changed state. They have begun listening. Next week, they listen. A 3rd one on her own has decided to listen. So this was a good choice. However, now when she decides to do something next week, she says, okay, the 2 who didn't listen, who are in red, I'm going to call them. And she calls them next. But this turns out to be a bad choice because now the 2 mothers who were green have turned red, and the one she called actually didn't change their state. So in short, a service call may not change a beneficiary state. On the other hand, beneficiaries may change states on their own. And under these circumstances, we have to prioritize 4,000 beneficiaries per week. So we cast this problem as a restless bandit, where we are trying to choose K out of N arms per week. So for those who may not be familiar, each arm in a restless bandit is a Markov decision problem where we have the mother can be in a bad state. She didn't listen to a Mitra message, or a good state. She'd listen to an Mitra message that week. Now we can act by calling the mother as a via service call or not. And we have a transition probability of going from a bad state to a good state, which is low if we didn't call, and which is higher. So you transition with a higher probability from bad state to good state if you do provide a service call. And so now we have, if you have 200,000 mothers, we have 200,000 of these arms, with each of them modeled as this kind of an MDP. And we have to choose the first 2,000 of these to figure out who to give service calls to. Now, this problem is piece space hard, so often we will rely on computing a Whittle index for a current state of each arm, and then choose the top K based on the Whittle indices. We use this algorithm that we developed at Chen et al. Tamas 2016 to compute these Whittle indices. And essentially a Whittle index, what it's trying to do is to offer subsidy such that the passive action of not intervening gives the same benefit as the active action of intervening. So the problem, again, as we've seen before, is that we don't have enough data in order to understand what are the transition probabilities of these mothers. So we do have from previous traces of mothers who have gone through MMITRA, their features, that's age, education, income level, etc., and engagement sequences, as in did they transition or not from bad state to good state when there was a service call or not. A lot more data without service calls, a lot less data with service calls. So in order to infer transition probabilities, we have tried multiple clustering approaches. So one of them that we've relied on here is that we take the transition probabilities of these different mothers and then cluster them and then learn a map from the features to these clusters. In other words, when a new mother comes in with a new set of features, age, education, income level, etc., we can predict which cluster she belongs to, therefore predict what are her transition probabilities, and then we compute the Whittle indices on a cluster basis and then choose the top K mothers. So this clustering approach compensates for lack of data because this way we collect, combined data from multiple mothers. And it also speeds up Whittle index computation because we are computing Whittle indices at the level of individual clusters. So I'll have a lot more to say about this in a minute. But with this setup, we've just completed a study with 23,000 beneficiaries. And again, we haven't seen this kind of restless bandits being applied on the scale earlier. So here we took 7,667 beneficiaries per group. One group was in the restless bandit group, one in round robin group, and the current standard of care. We are really trying to help Arman come up with the best use of their service call apparatus. So right now they don't provide outbound service calls, and that's what we're trying to help them with, coming up with a better way of using those service calls. We pulled 225 arms per week for 7 weeks. That is to say, we gave these beneficiaries, 225 of them calls every week. In the restless bandit group, these beneficiaries were chosen using Whittle indices. In the round robin case, we just selected beneficiaries, one group, then the next group, then the next group, using some sequential technique and then in the current standard of care, there is no service call because that's the current standard of care. And then we looked at how many more health messages were listened to over the current standard of care group in each of these different arms. And what we find here is on the x-axis, the weeks, and on the y-axis, how many more health messages were listened to. And what we find here is that with the restless bandit groups, a lot more messages shown in blue are listened to cumulatively over the current standard of care, whereas the orange, which is the round robin, you can see is hardly improving over the current standard of care. So it is really important to optimize who you give service calls to. And we can show with the linear regression model that the RMAP group achieves a statistically significant difference compared to the current standard of care, whereas the round robin group fails to achieve this statistical significance. We are now launching a new 100,000 beneficiary study very soon. And the ultimate goal is to really help this nonprofit use this technique so that they can optimize their service calls. And that's where we plan to transition the software to Arman. But there's many different applications of these restless bandits for these public health settings, and there are many interesting research challenges. I'm just going to give you an outline of a few that we are trying to address. But for those who might be interested in this topic, there's so much to do, and so many important applications. So one, for example, is in the area of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis causes 500,000 deaths per year in India. 3 million people are infected every year. And so patients have this terrible choice of having to take, for TB treatment, pills for 6 months. And this has got a lot of side effects. So patients don't want to take those pills. So they drop off of treatment, which is bad because then they get drug-resistant bacteria, etc. So again, we have this problem of health workers trying to take care of a large population, and they have to figure out, with their limited resources, who do they call every week, or every day. So in this case, for example, this health worker may say, okay, I'm going to call the first 3 patients. That's when she actually gets to know whether they had been adhering to taking the TB medication or not. And so she may say the first 2 were adhering, the last one is not. Then she has to decide, who do I call tomorrow in this set of patients? And she may call a certain other 3, and that's when she gets to learn of whether they were adhering or not. The point being that this setup is very similar to the Arman setup I showed earlier, except we have a challenge of partial observability. So in our NeurIPS paper, we showed how we can tackle this problem by this idea of a collapsing bandit. Specifically, when the arm is not played, when a patient is not called, then we just update our belief about the state of adherence of that patient. When a patient is called, now uncertainty collapses because we call the patient and the patient says, I took my medicine, so now we know their true state, or I didn't take my medicine, now again we know their true state. And with this collapsing of uncertainty, we can exploit that because that leads to a fixed number of belief states. We can show that these collapsing bandits are indexable if there's a certain set of policies, these threshold policies are optimal. We are able to exploit this idea of a collapsing bandit in order to come up with much faster algorithms. So you can see here, this is now entirely simulation results on data that was gathered from tuberculosis patients, but this is purely simulation results showing that we are faster than the best baseline with losing very little in solution quality by exploiting this notion of a collapsing bandit. There are lots of other interesting areas to explore. I mentioned this data to deployment pipeline where we start with data, we map in our learning features to transition probabilities to try to be as accurate as possible with respect to transition probabilities. But then we are trying to choose the top K arms, and then we're going to test it in the field. So there are 2 stages. We are trying to learn to maximize learning accuracy, but then we are trying to maximize decision quality. Now, maximizing learning accuracy doesn't necessarily mean we maximize decision quality. And this is what we've been calling decision-focused learning. And I'm going to focus here on some work that Kai Wang is going to present at NeurIPS 21 in his paper. So basically, you can imagine an example here just for intuition, where we have some features and we're trying to predict transition probabilities. And then we want to choose the highest risk arms, highest risk TB patients, which are shown in red. But given this sort of a data in the 2-stage model, which first tries to learn a high accuracy prediction of transition probabilities, it will learn to figure out accurately to predict the low risk patients, but not the high risk patients. And so it has high learning accuracy, but low decision quality. On the other hand, a more decision-focused approach, which modifies the loss function to directly maximize decision quality, will focus more on higher decision quality and it will sacrifice learning accuracy because it's directly trying to go for the actual goal that we're trying to get at. And in simulation, we are able to show that a decision-focused approach can lead to higher decision quality, even though in terms of learning accuracy, it is actually worse. So the red is lower than blue for learning accuracy, but higher than blue for decision quality. I just wanted to quickly mention one last area of work, which is online learning with multiple actions for these bandits. Again, a very open and interesting area of work where there are multiple actions where we can imagine we can offer an SMS or a phone call or a home visit. We have a certain budget and we want to figure out what's the right allocation of this budget and where do we spend it in terms of patients. And so there's some recent work trying to look at these policies for index Q learning. There's really a lot that needs to be done, and we are pursuing some of these research threads, but I'll be delighted to discuss more in terms of robust restless bandits, risk-aware restless bandits, and so forth, just because we have limited data and there's a lot to do in terms of serving a large population. In the last bit on this area of public health, I wanted to highlight some work we did last year on agent-based simulation model. And so this is for COVID-19 screening and dynamics. I wanted to highlight one paper in Science Advances because that's the one that sometimes gets referenced. For example, in this New York Times article a couple of weeks ago on where are the tests. And so this work came out of our collaboration with Michael Mina in the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, where he approached us to try to do some modeling for him. And so at the time, and even now, we're struggling with trying to figure out what is the right way of testing. Should it be these gold standard PCR tests that have high sensitivity, meaning they can detect very low viral concentration, but are a higher cost and take time to get back results, versus antigen strips, which are less sensitive, require higher viral concentrations, but are low cost. And we can get results in 15 minutes. Some of you may have tried it at home and you get those results quickly in 15 minutes. And the question is, if you're Harvard or if you're some other university and you want to figure out, you want to test the student population, which approach should you use? Should you use the PCR or the antigen strip? And so on the y-axis here are total infections. On the x-axis is the two methods, PCR and antigen strip. Higher is worse, lower is better. And you can see that if we were able to test the entire student population every 3 days, and then isolate people as soon as we find any one of them is positive, and we got results back instantaneously, then it turns out that the more sensitive the PCR test is better because it reduces the total number of infections. However, as we said, the blue, the PCR actually may get a whole day's delay before we get the results back, unlike our antigen strip, which gets us results in 15 minutes. And just because of that day's delay, there's a day's delay in isolating positive people. And now we can see that it loses all its advantage in terms of total number of infections. Because of cost, if we can only run PCR every 5 days, again, all the advantage is lost. In other words, rapid turnaround time and frequency is more critical than sensitivity for COVID-19 surveillance. And this was the title of basically the title of the paper in Science Advances. This received extensive coverage in New York Times and so forth. I guess one of the most proud moments was seeing Dr. Fauci talk about this paper. So that was great. And Michael Mina is, of course, communicating with the Biden task force on COVID and so forth. I want to emphasize that this is really Michael leading the charge. We were just glad that we could assist him in some way in providing models and simulation results so that could bolster his arguments about why these rapid tests are better. So I wanted to take a short break to see if there are some questions we can answer, maybe for a few minutes. And then I wanted to just quickly cover some work on conservation that we have done. So at this point, maybe we can take some short questions if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. In the first part of the talk, you used this robust framework as sort of a maximum formula. And I'm wondering how important it was to choose that versus, say, average case or something else. Was it really most important just to do something sensible? And if so, then was that choice for tractability?
So I guess, no, that's a good question. If we had tried something without, basically we have a situation where we don't have a very good estimate of the transition probabilities. And had we heuristically chosen some kind of transition probabilities and gone with it, at least in simulation, it seemed to perform worse than the robust approach that we have shown. Now, in the experiments, because real world experiments are expensive and difficult to carry out, had we tried something like that, it probably would have beaten the degree centrality approach. However, at least in simulation, that approach was beaten by these kinds of robust approaches. And so that was the choice that we went after. But you're right that, in terms of something even more clever, in terms of being able to somehow do something that is able to at least take some input from the data that is out there, that would be an even better choice. So I guess there's a lot to do here in terms of what kinds of algorithms to develop. I'm not sure if that's the line of questioning that you were after, but happy to answer more.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Go ahead, Nikhil.
Yeah, I guess maybe just following on that question and something you just said, do you think you're like close to the limit of just like the inherent uncertainty in the problem, or like do you actually think that like there's like an algorithm out there that will beat your performance by like 20% or something?
I don't know about 20%, but I'm sure there's an algorithm out there that'll do better. Right now, for example, there is data that is available from all of these experiments about how influence spreads. So there's a paper that we followed up with trying to match it with different models of how influence would spread. And the match to the different models, including ones we've ourselves proposed, was not as great. And so in a sense, if we can come up with a better model that matches the data that are available from all of these experiments, then I suspect we would do better than what we have done. I don't know how much better, but when this work was done, it basically there's no data or limited data, and essentially we didn't take that into account. So in a AAAI submission, we are trying to look at complex contagion models, hoping that could be a way. But again, matching that data to these models is something that we have yet to do. So in short, there is data now, and with that data, we could do better.
I'm curious with the tuberculosis phone call scenario, whether you tried to model whether people were answering their questions truthfully.
Yes. So this was a simulation result. I agree that they may not. In a follow-up paper, we also said, well, what if there's 10% non-truthful answers and so forth. This is something that is currently entirely being done in simulation. And so there's a lot of behavioral studies that would need to get done to try to figure out. Our assessment in talking to the actual health workers on the ground was that they sort of got a sense of whether the person was being truthful to them or not. They have a relationship with these people. And so we estimated that, that they have a sense of whether they're being lied to, et cetera, or whether, people are being truthful in whether they took their medicine or not. But it's a great question. And there's a lot of behavioral study that would need to get done in that context of this tuberculosis prevention. In the case of Arman, the state is observable. And so we can actually see basically just on the phone call record whether they listen to the message or not. So there, that question doesn't arise. But when the state is unobservable, clearly there are those possibilities. Great. I know we are at 40 minutes. I'm going to go through for the next 5-10 minutes or so, 10 minutes or so, just some of the work that we've done in poaching prevention and human-wildlife conflict prevention. Here, I'll just outline some of the overall ideas of what we've pursued. So the basic problem in national parks, such as the Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda, is there's wonderful wildlife there, but there's threats to the wildlife, snares or traps, thousands of them that get placed to try and maim and kill these animals. And rangers have to patrol these parks, trying to locate these snares. And you can imagine that this is an extremely difficult task if they have thousands of square kilometers to patrol and a very small limited number of rangers. By the way, these are my photos from a different park, Murchison Falls National Park in Uganda. So these parks, you can imagine, we can divide them into 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid square. And then we are trying to predict where these snares are in order to help the rangers. So going back to our pipeline, we are going to make predictions on where these snares are, and then prescribe patrolling, taking into account how poachers may change their behavior if we patrol in a particular ways, and then test that in the field. So the first step was just making predictions. And so here we had 14 years of data, for example, from Uganda, when we did our first test on per kilometer grid square, the area slope, area habitat, range of patrol frequency, etc. I'm going to skip over the ensemble that we built in order to make these predictions in favor of the first test that we ran was in Queen Elizabeth National Park in the fall of 2016, where we selected 2 9 square kilometer areas that were very infrequently patrolled. And these are the green dots, which are not on top of the red dots. The red dots are where snares were found previously. And we asked that rangers patrol these, and you're going to find snares. So you have not patrolled these before, but our predictive model, we're so confident you're going to find snares there in this new area. And this just happened to be a month before the AMA's deadline. So that means if we could find snares, we're going to write a paper. If not, there's not going to be any paper. So rangers went out on patrol. Every day they would send us back messages. Initially, there was nothing, but then they found a poached elephant with its tusks cut off, and then a whole elephant snare roll that they removed. So poachers were active in the area. They were killing elephants, but before they could kill the next set of elephants, we were able to remove this elephant snare roll and therefore potentially save lives of elephants. Following that, 10 antelope snares were also removed. So this gave us confidence that this pilot test worked. And so the next step then was in 3 national parks, we selected 24 areas in each of them. Some we designated where our model predicted was high risk. Some our model predicted were low risk. So these were all infrequently patrolled areas. The point here was to show that it's not the case that any infrequently patrolled area is going to find snares. We can discriminate between high risk and low risk areas. And then having done these predictions that were not shared with the rangers, we asked them to patrol for 6 months and report back what happened. And what we find is that where we predicted high risk, indeed, more snares were found. Where we predicted low risk, indeed, less snares were found. So this is very promising in terms of being useful to the rangers in order to eliminate snares and improve snare captures. So this is in Cambodia, in Sripak Wildlife Sanctuary. The number of snare captures from 2018 to 2019 jumped 5-fold. These are actual pictures of snares that were captured because of our prediction. In 2021, 1,000 snares were found because of Buzz, which is the software that we've built in March. So all of this is really very useful to the Wildlife Conservation Agency. So we are very grateful now that they have not only decided, but actually integrated our PAWS predictive system with SMART platform. SMART is the software that rangers around the globe use in 800 national parks to track poacher movements and so forth. So by integrating the two, essentially rangers can download PAWS and see our predictions as to where to patrol. And so this is now getting used in different parks. People are testing this software. And so this is very exciting in terms of what's to come, in terms of being able to be of service to the rangers in protecting endangered wildlife across the globe. So more to come here. But the next step beyond that is interesting from a game theory perspective, because now we have a behavior model of our poachers. Can we now solve games to try to give predictions to the rangers? And again, basically, we are going to take each of these areas, these grid squares, and then cast it as a game where we are trying to solve this Stackelberg model, where the rangers are going to generate patrols based on this model. Since I'm seeing that we are at 45 minutes, I'm going to just quickly go through the rest of this presentation. Again, we have uncertainty in the adversary model. So it's very much like the situation we faced earlier, where we cast this problem as a game where the algorithm is trying to choose patrol strategy, but nature is trying to choose adversary behavior parameters to cause our algorithm patrols to perform as worse as possible. And we solve this game using a reinforcement learning approach to show that we can minimize maximum regret. Now, this is again done in simulation with data, but this is yet to be tested in the field. Some other areas of future work, one of them is integrating real-time data about poachers. So this was work done with a nonprofit called Air Shepherd. They fly drones in South Africa, collecting real-time images of whatever is happening in the park. And this is infrared images. And so you have to spot poachers from these images. And you can see that this is extremely difficult for a human being. So we built this system called Spot to automatically detect poachers and wildlife, and offered this to Air Shepherd to test in the field and use and so forth. Now, one of the interesting challenges that comes up as a result is this optimal deceptive signaling. So basically, you can imagine that we've spotted poachers in the park. Now, the drone is flying overhead. The chance that it is able to alert a nearby ranger to try and come and stop these poachers is small, let's say 0.3. With a high probability, there is no ranger nearby. And so the question is, what can the drone do? So our friends, these Air Shepherd, the way they try to deal with the situation when there is no ranger nearby is to turn on the light of the drone and fly towards the poacher to signal that rangers are coming. However, this sort of deceptive signaling, the rangers can figure out, the poachers can figure out, because if you always turn on the lights and fly towards them when there are no rangers nearby, they will know that this is a fake and they'll stop running away. So the key question is, how do you optimally send this deceptive signal? And so the basic idea then is to truthfully signal when, in some cases, when the ranger is there, ranger is present, you truthfully signal that there is a ranger present. But when there is no ranger present, with some probability here, 0.3, you do signal, but in other cases, you do not signal. The point here is that from a poacher's perspective, the signal is kept, the probabilities are such that the poacher knows that they're being deceived, but the probabilities are managed so that it's still in the poacher has a higher expected utility of running away rather than still continuing on to poaching. So lots to do here, because ultimately these signals and so forth, whether the poacher saw them or not is uncertain, whether we detected the poachers correctly or not is uncertain. And so lots to do here to deal with uncertainty. Another area is that there are data-rich parks, such as Sripak Wildlife Sanctuary, where there are lots of observations. But there are data-scarce parks, such as the Royal Belem Park in Malaysia. And here you want to recommend patrols to collect data as well as to prevent illegal activities, which is a balancing of exploration and exploitation. So in our AAAI paper, Lily Shu's work looked at how to generate these kinds of patrols. balancing exploration and exploitation, and presented newer algorithm, in this case lizard, which in particular exploits smoothness in order to come up with better regret bounds. I'll end by presenting this work on human-wildlife conflict, which is going on within Google Research India. The basic idea here is to predict where tigers and other wildlife might attack nearby farmers. And this is work that we did in order to make these predictions of high risk, which are shown in orange blobs here. And the goal here is to get that to be used in order to allow the government to do a better job of distributing resources. And this is something that is currently being undertaken. So this is very much work in progress. We've submitted a paper to the IAI conference and got good reviews. So hopefully you will soon see this work being used. I know at that time, I wanted to, just in case there are students here, provide 2 job alerts at Google Research India. If you like the kind of work you've seen from our lab in India, there are openings for research scientists, for anybody else. There are openings for visiting scientists, for postdocs or pre-docs, and also at Harvard Circus Center, which I lead, postdoc positions with a deadline of December 15th. So please, if there are students in the audience, I hope you'll apply. I'm happy to chat about them. So I'll end by talking about some of the key lessons that I wanted to highlight. First, achieving social impact and AI innovation go hand in hand. Second, our goal is really to empower nonprofits to use AI tools and avoid being gatekeepers to AI technology for social impact. We have to focus on the entire data to deployment pipeline and not just on improving the algorithms for achieving social impact. It's important to step out of the lab and into the field and to embrace interdisciplinary work, in this case, social work or conservation. And finally, lack of data is the norm, a feature and part of our project strategy. So thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to take any of your questions and happy to think about collaborations for AI for social impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Further questions? Sid? Christina.
Oh, sorry, that was also an applause to a great talk. But I'm really curious to hear a little bit about the RL algorithms that you use. You used it in a few different places. I'm kind of curious if you found a lot of variation in terms of like which algorithms seem to perform well or not, and what whether you I guess I'm just curious to know what RL algorithms you used and whether you needed to deal with like very large state and action spaces, or your problems tend to be smaller in size.
I see. So I guess in the case of the influence maximization work, where the goal was really to be able to apply it so that at test time, the algorithm would run really fast. The states, the graph size and so forth that we are looking at is 1,000 nodes and so forth. So it's not like a massive scale graph. However, if you try to run the change algorithm online in real time, then it was slower, and this just was allowing us to be applying it to be faster and so forth. In the case of mirror, which was the other situation where I suggested that it got applied, this was in the area of conservation where we're trying to do min-max regret. And so that's the other place where it was applied. In this case, it's really not being used to learn transition probabilities. It is really just used as a planning algorithm. The third place where I mentioned it was applied was in the context of Restless bandits. There it was actually used to learn Q values for the bandit arms and so forth. And so there, each different contexts, and sometimes it is really used purely as a planning algorithm, and sometimes it's really being used to learn actual transition probabilities and so forth. In terms of actual use in the field, we haven't been able to use it. What's generally happened is that what is used in the field are not these RL algorithm based approaches, but rather the other algorithms. The RL approaches are ones that we are, using and testing more in the lab at present time. And so at some point we'll have to sort of, there's a lot that needs to be done, I suppose, before it would actually get used in the field. The Restless Bandit ones are the ones that are closest in terms of where we are in terms of trying to apply them. But the basic issue is that the number of actual trials that would be needed and so on and so forth are massive. And this is not going to happen in the real world, at least at this point in time. And so how to actually use it is something that's interesting and something that we need to figure out. Yeah, so it's lots. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Nikhil?
Yeah, so I guess Jamal had a question in the chat that relates to mine, so I'll just repeat his question first, which is what happens if pause is downloaded by the poachers? And I think sort of my follow-on question to that is, like, how important is it to model the poachers as like optimal game players as opposed to like some behavioral game theory stuff?
So it is modeled as it is not modeled as an optimal poacher behavior. It's not modeled as a game with a rational poacher behavior. Rather, we learn a model of the poachers as, from a decision, this ensemble of decision trees or what have you, as the actual behavior of the poachers. If they get a hold of that predictive model and they have the data, then they would know where we have high risk maps. And so we have been very careful to not publish any maps of high risk poaching spots in any of our papers. So if indeed the poachers get hold of the data set and predictive models and so on, this would be a problem. We've asked our collaborators about how paranoid we need to be about all of these things. So far, the answer is that we don't really need to be as concerned about sophistication of the poachers, but this could change. The concern, I guess, so the way we solve the game then is that we assume that the poachers are behaving according to this behavior model, and then based on that, we come up with our our patrolling strategy, assuming that the poachers will behave according to this sort of behavior model. And then the actual game that arises is because we assume that there is uncertainty in the poacher behavior model, and nature is trying to play against us in order to choose parameter settings for the behavior model to perform as worse as possible. So in other words, the game is somehow being played in some ways against nature rather than poacher, because we assume that we have a good predictive model of the poacher. It's a problem if the poachers actually get to know what we are predicting about them, and then they would that would be a problem for us.
May I ask the sort of general version of this question? So
Sure.
You end up giving examples of like your security games work as like examples of game theory being actually used in the field. And like various forms of Stackelberg, Nash equilibria, even Bayesian persuasion at the end. But in your experience, based on your previous work, like how much do we actually need to incorporate equilibrium models versus what you're suggesting where we do min-max against some kind of weaker model? Like what seems to work best in practice?
Great question. So I guess and goes to important discussions that we need to have. So the original work that we did with Stackelberg security games that were being used or are used by air marshals and so forth, we really have no adversary data. And so essentially this then gets modeled more or less as a zero-sum game, certainly for the Coast Guard and so forth, where we are assuming obviously that our loss is their gain and so forth. And so there we have no data, so we are assuming the worst about the adversary. In the poaching game, we have data, and therefore we can make predictions about adversary behaviors. And that's what we are using. And simultaneously, we assume that in the games, when we are doing counterterrorism, we are dealing with highly strategic adversaries who have the resources to conduct surveillance and then act appropriately. Whereas in the case of poaching and so on, the capability and resources of the adversaries are lower, and therefore, and also we have more data about them, and therefore relying on a behavior model seems more appropriate. So I guess that's where we are in terms of using a behavior model in one case and relying on essentially somehow a worst case or a zero-sum type behavior on in the other side. So that's I don't know if that answered your question. I'm happy to discuss this more.
No, yeah, that makes sense. So when, I guess at a high level, when you have more data, kind of these predictive models seem to do better, at least in practice, or?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we are able to show using this data, for example, that the poachers are reacting to our patrols, that they are withdrawing from areas where we patrol. So if we patrol an area intensively last month, that we can show that there is, fitting some kind of a model, we can show that they are actually reacting to this patrol and withdrawing from these areas and going to nearby areas. And so with this kind of data in hand, we can generate patrols that are more targeted, that are better. And if we just didn't have this data and we assume some kind of a rational poacher model, then it would not make the same kind of recommendations. So certainly having data, I mean, it's the same answer in some ways to the question Nikhil asked earlier about the influence maximization work. Certainly having made an assumption that there's an independent cascade model at work is better than maybe, some other, sort of not making assumptions about these models and so on. But now that we have data in hand, we can perhaps come up with a better model. And in some ways, this is a situation where if we had no poacher data at all in hand, then maybe we would have gone with some kind of a zero-sum model or something like that. But now that, I mean, there is a lot of data available about poaching, so we can use that to come up with a better patrolling strategy.
So I have one more question about like the first part of the talk. In all these problems where you're trying to suggest a policy, do you also try to predict what you think the outcome would be to try and in some sense, are you surprised by how effective these policies seem to be, or you don't have a prediction of how well these would do?
I see. Good question. I guess we can, run simulations post hoc based on the data that are away, from the samples that we got, and then compare our predictions to the actual results and see whether, how it all worked out. I don't remember if this was done or not. I guess we would assume that the predictions are going to not do as well, obviously, because what happens what we have certainly seen is that the assumptions made by the independent cascade model were not borne out in the actual data that we did get. So the model doesn't quite fit the data as well, and therefore the predictions likely wouldn't match, but still it outperformed the competition, and therefore this is what we assumed was adequate at this point.
Okay, maybe at this point we should just thank you once again for a really wonderful talk.
Thank you.
We'll be meeting with a group of students shortly, and then with many of us tomorrow. So
Thank you again. Thank you for listening.